volunteer at Project Step 1. I welcome you all to yet another fabulous webinar session, and today's topic is COVID-19 vaccines race. What do we know till now? We have with our wonderful speakers for the evening. We have moderator for today's session is Dr. Manu Chaudhary. She is a fellow of American Academy of Pediatrics, fellowship in pediatrics infectious diseases, Texas Children's Hospital. She's also a consultant pediatrics and pediatrics infectious diseases at Rainbow Children's Hospital, Bengaluru. I welcome you, Dr. Manu, and it's wonderful to have you here. We also have Dr. Jill E. Weatheritt, who is from Houston, Texas, USA. I welcome you also to this session. I look forward to having a wonderful session. So Project Step 1. So Project Step 1 is a volunteer-driven, non-profit collective of individuals from the startup community with volunteers and doctors from across India to provide free access to healthcare via telemedicine to the citizens affected by COVID-19 pandemic. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has made humanity face unprecedented crisis, but our doctors and the medical teams have proved to be the heroes over the past 8 months. Our Project Step 1 doctors have made great impact on 5 million lives and have done more than 900K consultations and have been successful in preventing more than 500K contacts. Dear doctors, Step 1 and the citizens need just 30 minutes of your everyday life. Your 30 minutes can save thousands of lives. Give us a missed call to 080-4719-2219 to join the largest doctor volunteer group. For today's webinar, COVID-19 has caused illness ranging from common cold to more severe diseases. The novel coronavirus is a new strain that has taken over our lives. There is a lot of buzz running around the vaccines too. So let's hear from our experts today on the panel. Over to you, Dr. Manu.
Hi, thanks, Shruti. Thank you so much. So let me introduce my speaker for the day, a great, brilliant infectious diseases physician from Texas Children's and a very dear friend. Good morning, Jill. So Dr. Jill Weatherhill is MD, MS, DTM, NH, and now a PhD as well, Assistant Professor, National School of Tropical Medicine, Department of Pediatrics, Tropical Medicine and Infectious Diseases, Department of Medicine, Infectious Diseases, and she is currently situated at Baylor College of Medicine, Houston, Texas, USA. So thanks for joining us, Jill.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. I look forward to learning about the organization as well. I know you guys are doing great work, and it's just such a pleasure to be here and to see you.
Yes, yes. Okay, so before we start, my big question for you is, when are you going to get to know your president?
Yeah. Don't we all want to know? I mean, it's just been such a stressful week here. The good thing, we kind of knew this was going to happen, just based on discussions before the election even happened. But hopefully in the next few days, there'll be a more clear answer.
Wow.
It's the weekend.
Okay. Who do you think will win?
You know, based on what the outcomes are right now, I mean, there is a potential winner. So it just depends on what will probably be a long litigation process moving forward.
Okay.
We all need it.
Yes. So let's come to the topic of the day. How is COVID-19 panning out now in US, and what do you think overall over the world, especially with some countries seeing second wave?
Yeah, we're heading into a really difficult time, actually. You know, we had some spikes when this first came out, that first wave in March and April, where we saw the virus spreading throughout the world. Obviously, first in areas of China, then into Europe, spreading into other areas of Asia and across the sea to the United States and South America. Many of the countries got that first wave under control. Several of them are still doing a wonderful job with spread and prevention of transmission and spread. And others are seeing secondary and tertiary waves. We're seeing massive outbreaks in many countries in Europe. And from our personal experience here, you know, we've just set world records here for the last 3 days with over 115,000 new cases a day here in the United States. So it's certainly out of control here in the States, and obviously in other parts of South America, Europe, mainly seeing those secondary and tertiary waves. So we're at a very critical point as many of these areas are going into winter months, which will certainly aid in transmission.
And more so, like, for India, I'm really worried about. So we saw spikes in September,
Right.
and then little bit of dip. But this, the festival season coming in, Diwali,
Yep.
and then Thanksgiving there, Christmas. I think we are still in midst of quite some, challenging times, right?
That's absolutely correct. So for many areas of the world, not everywhere, but many areas of the world, we're heading into holiday times, which is classic time for gathering of large groups, getting family and friends together. That's what these holidays and celebrations are about. And anytime you have large gatherings, particularly indoors, you're going to have transmission that occurs. And so it's critical that people understand how this virus is transmitted, what they need to do to prevent. But it's going to be incredibly difficult heading into holiday seasons, and then in areas like the United States and in Europe, where we're going into winter, that transmission risk is going to go way up.
Yeah. So coming to the most, I think everybody's looking forward about COVID vaccine. I think this is the most awaited human vaccine. So can you, for our viewers, speak about what are the phases of vaccine development, what goes into licensing, and how much time does it take from the trials being started to try, really getting to the common public?
Absolutely. So I think the most important thing for people to realize is this is incredibly unprecedented, what's been happening and what's going to happen. So standard timing from development to licensing and distribution of a vaccine is about 10 years. That's the mean. So 10 years it takes. We're into month 11 or month 10 and getting closer and closer. It's really quite extraordinary, the science and the technology that has been developed to move this process forward. And it will certainly go down as an incredible feat in science, what has been accomplished so far. Despite our yearning and wanting for the process to go faster, this has just been absolutely incredible. The fastest vaccine to date is actually a mumps vaccine that took 4 years. More recently, an Ebola vaccine took about 5 years. That was using some of the technologies that are currently in use here for the COVID vaccine. So it's just for everybody to know we're all anxious. We all want these vaccines to come out, but this speed that this is occurring under is really incredible and a testament to all the hardworking scientists and physicians and healthcare workers that are out there, and patients that are coming in to go on these clinical trials, and it's very much appreciated. But the process is incredibly long.
Wow. So could you just briefly talk about the phases? Everybody's talking about phase 1 to 2, 2 to 3. What are these phases?
Absolutely. So even before you get into the clinical trials, there's a preclinical phase, and that's what our lab does in the Center of Vaccine Development. We're a preclinical vaccine lab, and what that does is you use either cell cultures or animal models to evaluate the vaccines that you have developed, looking at side effects as well as in the immune response that you're looking for. And from there, typically, you go for what's called an investigational new drug, or from an IND from the FDA in the United States. And obviously that process is different depending on the country. And from there, then you can enter into clinical trials. And typically there are 3 phases, and they gradually increase in their complexity. So that phase 1 study is really just a safety study. It's very, very small, just a handful of people. And you're trying to find out what is the safest dose that you could give before you start seeing side effects. So you're really balancing the tolerability and the efficacy with only a handful of patients. And if that looks promising, you move into phase 2. And each of these phases, you increase the number of volunteers that are involved. And typically in phase 2, you're using the dose and the method of administration that you found in that phase 1. you'll see if you look at some of the vaccines for COVID, the phase 2 and the phase 3 are being lumped together. And that's just because they're doing some of the smaller side studies first, and that's going to morph into the phase 3, which are massive randomized controlled trials that are typically blinded, meaning the investigators don't know what if the patient or the enrollee is getting the vaccine or if they're getting a placebo, which is the non-vaccine injection. And that's typically thousands of enrollees in those studies, and that's really the data that you're looking for. And so this is just a gradual process of seeing if there's any side effects and what type of immune response. From there is where you're going to look for efficacy. So it's very difficult to know true efficacy in some of those smaller studies. And as you get into larger studies that go over longer periods of time, so these phase 3s usually takes longer because you're watching months afterwards whether anyone develops any adverse events. So currently there's over 200 vaccines that are in this process, and about 10 around the world, 4 in the United States that are in the phase 3 clinical trial. But it doesn't end at phase 3. That's the problem. We're talking about phase 3. Okay, then we'll get it into the public. But really after that is where we start to see the effectiveness and the true side effects that are involved in this vaccine.
Sure. Can you speak about some of which you think are definite candidates which we would see probably early next year, promising candidates for COVID-19?
Yeah, so I can talk in quite a bit of specificity regarding the 4 that are being trialed in the United States. These are multinational, many of which are occurring in India, Brazil, and in Europe. So the big 4 that we're using here, of course, there's a few in China, and there's 2 licensed in Russia that we're currently not using here in the States. But the 4 that are under investigation in the States are moving forward quite quickly. The first one is through Pfizer, and I also want to emphasize that the ones that were being tested here in the United States are new technologies. So there are some in China that are using live attenuated virus, which are more of the standardized vaccine modalities that we've used in other vaccines around the world. These technologies are brand new, and that brings some investigation, additional investigation, and additional uncertainty, but so far have been very, very promising. So the first one through Pfizer is what's called an mRNA-based vaccine, and there is no licensed mRNA vaccine to date. This vaccine uses what's called a lipid nanoparticle outer exterior that allows a cell to take up this genetic material, and within that genetic material is the spike protein receptor binding protein, which is the part that we're really trying to get a good, strong immune response to. And that's taken up through the cell produces that protein, and then the immune response is able to respond to it and build immunity. Typically with this vaccine so far, they're requiring 2 doses. The problem with this vaccine to date is that it requires deep freeze, and that's okay in areas that have rich resources, but maybe a problem rolling out globally. This is the most advanced vaccine we have. They're anticipating getting what's called EUA, which is emergency use authorization, sometime in November, so that they could start rollout in December, early January. So it's certainly our most advanced vaccine right now here in the United States. The second one that's close as well is the Moderna vaccine, which we've heard a lot about in the news. This is also an mRNA vaccine. And the reason these are much more advanced, it's a new technology, but it's actually very much more straightforward to make the vaccine. So that process actually went faster than some of the other more conventional technologies. This is also 2 doses and requires that deep freeze as well. And that we do have some results for this study, from this vaccine. Phase 1 trial was published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in July, which was what we talked about, that phase 1 dose, trying to find the dose, It wasn't randomized. It wasn't blinded. So we really need those bigger study results to know the effectiveness. So those two are moving along quite fast. The third one is the AstraZeneca, which is being used in India. It's the Covishield vaccine. This is multinational. It's using a chimpanzee adenovirus viral vector, which is a bit more known technology. The Ebola vaccines were using similar technology, and it seems to have a good effect. They did produce the result in their phase 1 and phase 2 trial in Lancet that showed positivity. And then the last one is the Johnson & Johnson, which is also a viral vector similar to the Ebola vaccines, multi-sites. The difference between this one is it's a single dose, which is very helpful, instead of trying to have to vaccinate everybody twice. Both of those two, the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson, which are the vector vaccines, did have pauses during their phase 3 trials, which I'm sure has been all over the news everywhere. But that's very standard in these phase 3 trials. So they're taking this very seriously, and both of those trials have gone back into their clinics.
Yeah. So Covishield this is the same as Oxford, which Oxford basically started in UK. So Covishield in India, the trials are running in around 17 states, and we do have some prelim studies which they haven't published yet, but mostly frontline work are being enrolled in these studies. So we are quite hopeful. And then we have some other, like we have a huge pharmaceutical company, Zydus, so they are present, and then one of the Russian vaccine, the Sputnik, the Ready labs are also, collaborating. So I think now is the time to collaborate and, get these vaccines tested, of course, with safety measures. And so I as you said, I think these are from my standpoint also some of the promising vaccines. The only concern is enrolling them out to to developing and underdeveloped countries, because I think for you guys, you're already top of the list, so you'll probably be using for your population then before rolling out to other countries, right?
Yeah, that's a major concern, and I'll kind of plug our vaccine center here, because I'm part of the Center of Vaccine Development at Texas Children's Hospital, which also has a COVID vaccine that's currently in development. We're actually licensed in India as well, so the licensure went and collaboration is with an Indian company that we've been working with. And the point of the vaccine that our group, which is led by Dr. Peter Hotez and Dr. Mary Elena Battazi, with the partnered BioE in India, is to have a vaccine that is more likely to be able to roll out to low and middle income areas, or areas that have lower resources. So the vaccines under development right now are using new technology that isn't readily available everywhere, and it requires a cold chain that isn't available everywhere. And so the vaccine that is being developed at Texas Children's Hospital in combination with BioE and another company, Path, uses a more standard process using recombinant protein. So it's similar to the hepatitis B vaccine, for example. So it's a very known technology, well used all over the world, and doesn't require that high level technology, and doesn't require the amount of deep freeze. And so Dr. Hotez and Dr. Patazi are very hopeful that this vaccine and others that are targeting low and middle income areas will be able to control this pandemic in areas that may not benefit from some of these newer technologies.
How wonderful. Thank you to your team working so hard. So how much what are the possible challenges of fast tracking these vaccines?
Right. So, for a vaccinologist, we're so used to this process taking years to decades that this fast pace is you really want to make sure that these are being tested effectively. And I think they are. I think they're going through the same process. They're just not having to deal with the bureaucracy, the red tape that comes with getting these vaccines licensed. So because they're being fast tracked, it's just not taking the extra steps. It's kind of weeding out those extra unnecessary steps while still ensuring the safety. So the biggest thing is safety at this point, and then people understanding that if they get the vaccine, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're protected right away, because we don't know. And so those two things need to be understood by the general public. If we get this vaccine and we roll it out, you still need to use your standard precautions because we don't know the true efficacy of what these vaccines will do. But I think for the most part, because those safety steps, because it's under so much global scrutiny, that fear that things are being rushed through are not as warranted as we might feel, given how fast this is going through, because there's so many eyes on this that one misstep, is going to be found and dealt with quickly.
Could you share some of the side effects which people have encountered during these trials? The not so scary, but some scary. Like, have there been like serious side effects or just like simple side effects which you would expect?
Manu, it's really hard because a lot of the data isn't published. So we've only seen 2 published studies. We've seen the Moderna phase 1 trial in the New England Journal of Medicine, and we've seen the Oxford AstraZeneca phase 1 in Lancet, and everything else has been a press release. And so, it's hard to know. So what we know about the Moderna vaccine from that one trial is that there are a lot of mild side effects with these vaccines. So with the mRNA vaccines, what they're seeing is a lot of injection site pain. Nearly every patient in that trial had it, and about over 50% had some of the more mild symptoms: fatigue, chills, headaches, myalgias. And that was similar with the Oxford phase 1 trial as well. Serious side effects or adverse events, there haven't been a lot, unless in these phase 1 trials, when they escalated the dose higher. So in some of these very high dose, they were seeing some adverse events, but those doses have been ruled out. So moving forward in the phase 2 and the phase 3, they're using the dose in which there's not the adverse events, but you get a good efficacy or a good immune response. Now with the Johnson & Johnson and the Pfizer vaccines, which are using both of those two had to the Oxford vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine both had a pause during phase 3, which because of an adverse event that someone in the trial had. So that's one person out of thousands, and they paused the whole trial to investigate. One of those in the Oxford had a neurologic event. We don't know more than that, but it was deemed not to be associated with the vaccine. And same with the Johnson & Johnson. So they're both back up and enrolling, saying that those adverse events were just incidental and weren't related to the vaccine. But really, it's the phase 4, the time after it gets rolled out into the general public, where we really start to see, and over time with these big phase 3, what those adverse events will be. But hopefully, based on what has been seen, they're mild adverse events at this point, which is localized symptoms and those myalgias, potentially
by giving
fever.
paracetamol. Some of them
Exactly.
actually paracetamol and then roll out the series again. So
Yep.
So there are many strains of COVID-19, right? Would these candidate vaccine cover all of them? Are they going to address the mutation? Are we seeing mutations? Like, how is that going to pan out?
Right. So that's a really great question. All viruses mutate. That's what they do. But that doesn't mean that their pathogenicity, how infectious they are, changes. They're just going to mutate over time. When we talk about viruses like the flu, for example, we know they have big changes. They can have big changes that affect how our vaccines work. And that's why each year there's a new flu vaccine that's developed to really try and target what that mutation is. That's not the same for coronaviruses. Coronaviruses really don't typically, in the history of what we know about coronaviruses, make large mutations that will change how they're acting. So there are some mutations, particularly in that receptor binding protein, that have occurred with suggestions that make that suggest that it has become that particular strain may be more infectious, but it really hasn't made a huge impact so far, and it should not affect vaccine development because it's not changing the structure of that protein. It's not significantly that these vaccines won't work. And that's fairly standard with all coronaviruses in comparison to influenza.
Okay. So I think you already spoke about like how many doses might be required. Can you briefly talk about the kind of immunity that is expected post vaccine? And what do these studies read, and what have we seen so far in regards to that immunity being developed?
Absolutely. So with vaccines, we focus a lot on the B cell response. So the B cell response is the antibodies. And so you'll see a lot of people talking in the news. You'll see a lot of papers coming out that's talking about B cells and the antibodies. And what they're looking for is what are called neutralizing antibodies. So you can develop antibodies, but those antibodies might not do anything to the virus. They just recognize it. They let the virus go do whatever it wants. But neutralizing antibodies will actually prevent the binding of the virus to the receptor. And that's the type of antibody you want. So you kind of have to weed through what the antibody is. So a lot of these studies, when you'll look at what's published, they'll say, okay, we had an IgG antibody response, and of that, the titer or how much of the neutralizing antibody is, what they'll list the titer. So you really want to look at what that neutralizing antibody is. The antibody total tells you, okay, that at least the immune response is recognizing the protein or the antigen, and it's making a response. But let's see, the efficacy is going to be in that specific subtype of antibodies called neutralizing antibodies. And that is important. That is a very specific response. But there's also what's called cellular immunity or T cell immunity. And that's very important, particularly in viral infections where we rely heavily on what are called CD8 cells and CD4 cells. And so these studies are looking at that T cell response as well. Those are another mechanism in which the virus can be killed by these T cells and engagement of effector cells, so cells that will break down the virus. And so, again, we have very little data on these vaccines so far, really just those first phase 1 studies. So what the actual immune development has been is not well understood, not well known. I'm sure the publicly the pharmaceutical companies likely know and will publish this data once they have everything together. But at least within the Oxford study in Lancet, they did find spike protein specific T cells, which is very, very good. And then they did find neutralizing antibodies. So that's very promising when you have both of those together. It's two different mechanisms to prevent infection.
Sure. So your antibody will, so basically the neutralizing antibody will protect you during these couple of months. And then if this becomes, an yearly episode, then maybe your T cell immunity can reactivate and protect you during those episodes. Am I saying it right?
Yeah, so both T cells and B cells will form memory. And that's the big goal here, is you want your body to remember what it saw so that when it sees it again, it will make a faster response. So once you see a virus, your body will form a response to it. It just takes a long time. So it usually takes about 2 to 3 weeks for your body to generate those antibodies on their own. In this case, why we use vaccines is because we want to cut that time period out. We want your body to already have recognized it So they can, your immune cells say, okay, I've seen this before, let's go. And it will start to produce those antibodies, and those T cells will start to kill off the virus immediately.
Do we need to worry about like antibody enhancing disease with these vaccines? Because I think with dengue vaccine, we saw that.
Yeah, and there's definitely been some concern with coronavirus vaccines and early development, particularly through SARS. I know our lab, before I joined, they developed a SARS-1 vaccine, and at that time during that development, there was a lot of concern that if you develop a vaccine to the entire spike protein, there is risk of enhanced immune response, as they saw in the dengue vaccine. What has happened since then, and what's been learned, is that doesn't typically happen if you're targeting the specific protein, the receptor binding protein. And so that's what most of these companies are actually targeting, and hopefully we won't experience that enhanced immunologic response.
Hopefully. Okay. I think there was a question about, how much does a vaccine reduce the risk of COVID-19 and its complication? Can you like talk about the efficacy of vaccines, and what kind of efficacy are we expecting with these COVID vaccines?
Yeah, so again, a lot of this is still unknown. I mean, most of these studies, what we know is the safety part. And that at this point is the most important. How efficacious, we really don't know. There's estimates that some of these vaccines will be about 50% efficacious. And, that seems like it's not great. But honestly, at this point, to slow this pandemic down, a 50% efficacy actually could be very, very helpful. So that's kind of a prediction, but really we don't know what the efficacy is going to be. There is studies in animal models that show, around the 50 to 70%, but animals, of course, are not humans. And what that response will truly be, we won't know until we see the results of these phase 3 trials. But as I mentioned, that if it's 50% initially, that is still very, very helpful. And just for everybody to understand that when a vaccine rolls out, that first vaccine, the second vaccine, that will certainly not be our end vaccine. So this will develop over time. It will become better over time. And that's classically how these vaccines are done. So you get a vaccine out, you get some efficacy. While this pandemic is happening, people are still going to be working and moving forward to make these vaccines better.
True. Is there any difference in naturally acquired immunity or vaccine-induced immunity? And do you think people who have had COVID, would they need the vaccine if they had a milder disease, and only severe disease patients would need it? Could you just briefly talk about that?
Absolutely. This is a really important point. A lot of people have been talking about, why don't we just do herd immunity, natural immunity, build it up, and protect the community. And there's a lot of problems with this theory. So first, there really hasn't been a time in history where we've had a new infection and you've been able to get herd immunity without a vaccine, because the death toll, the long-term morbidity is so high. There is some precedent with influenza. So for example, in the H1N1 outbreak, people who had a previous exposure to an H1N1 flu, which is, back in the 60s and 70s, had a better response to the pandemic in 2009. So it was actually the younger children, the ones who hadn't been exposed to an H1N1, that had a harder time dealing with that pandemic. So that's some evidence that you can get some natural immunity, but that's from a virus that we see all the time. This virus is new, and we don't know if there's that cross reactivity as of yet. And we don't know if you get what's called durable immunity. So there's some evidence that you get some T cell memory, you get some neutralizing antibody, but how long that lasts, how efficacious that is, particularly if you've had mild to moderate symptoms, is largely unknown. There are several studies that show antibody waning close to 3 to 4 months after infection. And so we have started to see reinfections in people who were previously infected. So I would not hang my hat on herd immunity, it's actually would be incredibly dangerous. So it's suggested that to get herd immunity for coronavirus, so each virus herd immunity percentage is going to be different, and that's based on the reproductive number, how easily the virus is transmitted from one person to the other. So, for example, for measles, which is highly infectious, the herd immunity level is 92%. So 92% of people have either had to have had measles or been vaccinated to provide herd immunity. So based on how quickly coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2 spreads, it's predicted that you would need about 60 to 70%. And of course, in the media, it's, that range is all over the place, but most scientists believe somewhere in that 60 to 70%. So if you took the United States numbers, for example, you would need more than 200 million people to be infected to get to that level. And at a case fatality rate of 2.4%, that's millions of deaths that would happen going for natural herd immunity. And that's why we rely so heavily on vaccines, because you can get to that point without the deaths and without the long-term morbidity of natural infection. And you can control the durability of that immune response better by giving boosted dosing. So that's where we're hoping you can get to that herd immunity level without the mortality, without the long-term morbidity or long-term effects of this infection. But we're going to need 60 to 70% most likely to be vaccinated to get to that level.
So do you think is it a possibility that by the time we have a good vaccine rolled out, you might have had enough number of patients, like a herd immunity develop? Is it possible?
It's certainly possible. I don't think that will happen just because of, at that point, the hospitals would be totally overrun. The mortality rate would be so high. I think our vaccines are far enough along that to get to that point will be years versus a vaccine that I think will be available this spring.
Okay. Because it's quite contagious, right? But as you said, I think the message is very clear. Why lose more lives when we have a better, way to protect our community?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, coming to the point of who's gonna get it, the vaccine, because there's a question will COVID-19 vaccine be mandatory? Who do you think would be some of the first? How is it gonna be enrolled in public?
Right. So exactly. So that's a huge step too. We talk about the phases, but we don't often talk about the next steps. And typically, honestly, that's the longest part, for licensing a vaccine, for manufacturing, the distribution and the allocation can take years as well. And so there's already plans in place for all of these. So this is where that warp speed has been put into place, where a lot of these steps that are usually sequential are actually overlapping. So in terms of how it's going to work in the United States, according to our CDC, it will go to healthcare workers first, or frontline workers. And that will include obviously doctors and nurses, but also, food service, janitorial staff, anybody who's in that hospital setting that needs to be protected. Then it would go to high risk groups, including the elderly and those with underlying conditions. Children likely will not be included, particularly in the first round, because of the scarcity of resources and knowing the lower risk to children. So that's likely going to be the progression. In the United States, at least, it's been said that these vaccines will be free, other than any sort of administration charge that occurs from, wherever the office or company that you get it from. But the vaccine itself, to date, has been promised to be free to the public. And hopefully through some of the other organizations that are involved globally, including, CEPI and Gavi and the World Health Organization, that would be similar throughout the world.
world. So even in India, I think the frontline workers are the ones who are even being enrolled in the trials, and that's the target population. Apart from that, the police officers, where there's a lot of interaction with the public, those people.
Right.
Because children, as we've seen all over the world, is less than 2% of these sicker COVID patients. I think children would be, way down the list and there's a question also, what about young children who are less likely to get the severe disease? Would your approach to clinical trials be different? So coming to that point, like what is the sequence of testing? So of vaccine, and especially COVID vaccine, when would it be tested for I think right now it's high risk population, and then phase 3 is general population. When will it come to checking if it comes to susceptible children? When will that start?
So typically in these phase trials of vaccine, adults are tested first. So that's pretty standard. Adults go first, then they start to enroll children. Because the focus of this particular disease is on the adult population, that will certainly be a focus for a while, and eventually they'll introduce children. Now, the one population that often gets overlooked is pregnant women, right? So these are adults that are high risk that should be tested, but are often left out because of the fear of any adverse events to a pregnant woman and the developing fetus. So that's an area that's often debated as to when do you start to introduce pregnant women into these trials, especially with new technologies that haven't been used before. So that is an area, a kind of a gray area. Children will certainly come later, but they're not going to be the focus up front. But many pediatricians, as well as obstetricians, are really pushing to get children and pregnant women involved in these trials, not just in vaccine trials. This is happening with therapeutics as well, where these two subgroups are often left out. And the problem is it's not that children don't get the severe disease and pregnant women don't get the severe disease. They absolutely do. It's just not as frequent. But we have to have options as pediatricians when we see, children who are ill from this disease and know what to do. So,
like cystic fibrosis, diabetes, children who do get really sick.
Yeah, there are certainly children that get very ill from this disease, and that's why a lot of pediatricians and certainly the pregnant women definitely get sick from this disease. And obstetricians are really pushing to get these subgroups involved in therapeutic trials as well as in vaccine trials.
Do you think this vaccine will also, continuing on the topic of children, would also help with MIS-C?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we just don't know, and largely because the process of MIS-C is largely unknown as well. So what is that trigger that a child who had mild to asymptomatic disease 4 to 6 weeks later develops this hyperinflammatory response? That period of time, that trigger, which we think is probably unregulated antibody response, but we really don't know. And so having that uncertainty in the process really makes it uncertain as to how that would affect the development of MIS-C later on. But the thought would be is if you don't get SARS-CoV-2 at all, then you're not going to develop MIS-C. So potentially it would be a preventative measure for those more delayed hyperinflammatory reactions, which we are actually seeing in adults as well. So we just put out a paper comparing the MIS-C with an MIS-A, as we're seeing more commonly, more recognized in the adult population as well.
Interesting. For general population, what would be a good source to get an update on these vaccines? Where are they? Who are they available for? Where they can enroll for clinical trials? Can you highlight some of those sources?
Yeah, so at least for us, clinicaltrials.gov will have every clinical trial, no matter what it is, for therapeutics and for vaccines, are listed, and you can get phone numbers and you can see where you can contact to get enrolled.
Okay.
But that at least in the States, I'm not sure what's available in India.
Yeah, so we have our organization, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. I think they also have, published their numbers, and also that would be a good source of information for vaccine, and for all these clinical trials. So I would request people to go through those websites before enrolling, or getting more information for these vaccines. I think you did speak about Ebola vaccine development, but could you share some more learning experiences from previous pandemics, like flu, and then development of Zika, and then I think the world is this is how I put it: the world is coming to an end. There were forest fires beginning of this year. We saw these horrible microcephaly with Zika, and now COVID the whole year. So I'm just so worried. But
Yeah.
for scientific society, what have we learned from these pandemics?
Yeah, I think, what we should all take away from this is the incredible importance of a strong public health system. I mean, it is just critical. And you can see countries that have a strong public health system are doing great, that took this seriously, that, went after it from the beginning, are, have controlled this virus. I mean, you see it in Australia, for example. We've seen it in New Zealand, Thailand. I mean, it's just, there are countries that are doing a really good job. I mean, some of them are smaller, some of them are, island and secluded. So there is a lot of more variability as you talk about the United States, or you talk about India, which, there's a lot more people, but it can be done. And it's done through a strong public health system. And we need to be investing in that. And having a section that is dedicated to pandemics for monitoring and tracking, and that's what the CDC does. But the tools just weren't there to do it. And I think moving forward, it certainly will be. The other part is in terms of therapeutic and vaccine development, having the pipelines in place to quickly develop new therapeutics and vaccines. And I think we'll also have that moving forward here after Ebola, particularly, and then now. And what we can compare this to is the flu. So H1N1 in 2009, a vaccine was developed fairly quickly. And the reason is because the pipeline is already in place. We make a new vaccine every year. We can adjust that vaccine every single year. So a new strain is available, you just swap out the antigen. I mean, it's obviously more difficult than that, but we've done it and it happens every year. And so that's why a H1N1 vaccine was able to be rolled out very quickly. And that needs to be the same for all of these other emerging and re-emerging infections. So when you look at Ebola, for example, they developed these new technologies, the mRNA vaccine, the viral vector vaccines, and now we're being able to use that same technology for COVID-19. So now that we have that technology in place, those will now be pipelines if a new virus specifically emerges, to just once you know about the virus, you know what proteins are immunogenic, which ones are going to be good for the immune system to respond to. I mean, super basic. It's much more complicated than this, but really swapping out the antigen. And if you know that technology works, you have the pipeline in place to get this out quickly. And I think that's what's going to change moving forward. Good public health system with a pipeline for vaccine development.
And not to forget that what we have, let's protect ourselves against it. So, with winter coming in, with all these festivities coming in, it's very, very important that the whole family, gets immunized against flu at least. And it is a menace around the world.
Yes, the best thing that you can do is get a flu shot and wear a mask. I mean, the flu, can be very, very devastating. We know that every year, and we constantly tell people, get your flu shot, get your flu shot. Get it this year, because if you get sick from the flu, you're not going to know right away if it's flu, if it's COVID. You can take that. I mean, it's not 100% effective, of course. You can still get flu if you've had the vaccine, but it typically attenuates that disease. It makes it not as severe if you do get it. or it prevents it. And it can be very, very beneficial, not only for doctors and healthcare providers to know what you have, but also to prevent you from going into the hospital, so that you're not taking up a hospital bed, that you're not using up resources, and that you're not being exposed if you go to the hospital to COVID too. You know, you don't want to be in the hospital right now if you don't have to, both to reserve resources and to protect yourself.
Absolutely. And then, we are coming to end of our session, but some points I wanted to cover. So a lot of people are asking me about this, should we get BCG? Should we get an MMR? What are your thoughts and takeaway from this?
Yeah, I find these very interesting, and there's a lot of trials on right now. So the idea behind these vaccines is that in early childhood, children are exposed to a plethora of antigens, and they're training their immune system, particularly during that first year. And what has been seen in the past, particularly with BCG, it's probably the most studied, that areas that get BCG, or children that get BCG early on, are typically protected from other respiratory viruses. So it not only prevents the severe consequences of tuberculosis, but also because it trains the innate immune system early, which are the first cells that fight an infection, which are incredibly important in respiratory viruses, that it may actually, because you're getting a better, more trained innate immune system earlier, that it could prevent respiratory viruses. And that's the concept that's being introduced here with use of BCG. The question is if you're an adult and you've already have a trained immune system, does BCG, does MMR actually do anything? And we don't know. I mean, that's the trials that are underway, and hopefully it does. You know, we want all of these to be successful, so we have a lot of different options, but whether it does or not is really uncertain.
So the suggestion would be, please hold off unless you're part of a clinical trial. Please don't go and get
this is across the board for any of this. You know, there's a lot of ideas. Everything should be tested. We shouldn't knock down any idea, but they should not be used for general purposes. That's for vaccines, that's for therapeutics, unless you're involved in a clinical trial. It could be very dangerous, and we don't know if these are effective or not. So clinical trials are well organized, they're monitored, they have safety profiles, and that is the way to really understand if these are safe and if it's effective.
And my message to my Indian viewers is there are vaccine trials happening in India. There are a lot of these network, collaborative network, as Dr. Jill talked about, that we will be able to enroll these vaccines to people in India as well who really require them. So hold on, focus on, ensuring what you already have, wearing a mask properly, maintaining physical distance, isolating yourself while you have some, URI symptoms. So do what you can and wait for what is, in pipeline, and maintain the safety.
I'd like to say really quick though, Manu, that's another really important point for everyone to understand, is even when vaccines roll out, that doesn't mean the mitigation strategies end. So even if you get a vaccine, you still need to wear a mask, you still need to do physical distancing, you need to wash your hands. I mean, all those things, they're going to be the same. It doesn't magically go away when the vaccine rolls out. We don't know the true efficacy. We don't know how each individual is going to react in terms of their immune response. So you have to keep doing those same mitigation strategies even as the vaccine rolls out.
Do you think would we be doing antibody testing before giving these vaccines?
I don't know. I'm sure there'll be studies that look at antibodies before and after. Certainly there'll be studies in patients who have had COVID who then get the vaccine. But there's just a lot of unknowns, and all of that needs to be studied for sure.
Okay. And then my last question for you today is, while we still waiting for the vaccine, I think this was one of the questions put forward, what do you think about the other medications, antivirals in pipeline? Like, do we have other things in our doctor's pocket to help?
Right. So I like to talk about it as, our toolbox. What kind of tools do we have available as healthcare workers. So at this point, based on the data we have available, the only proven therapeutic is dexamethasone. So dexamethasone is an anti-inflammatory that has been proven effective in Solidarity trial for patients who are on oxygen. So if you have mild symptoms, you're at home, doesn't work. If you are in the hospital and requiring oxygen, it has reduced mortality. So that should be a mainstay at this point from the knowledge that we know. The second medication that is used most frequently at this point, at least in the United States, I know it's different in different countries, is remdesivir, which is an antiviral medication. And there are studies that show it's effective, studies that show it's ineffective, and it's probably dependent on when you get that antiviral, because there's different phases of this infection, right? There's the viral replication phase, and then there's the immunologic phase. So the Act 1 trial, which was done, all over the world, but we had actually a site here at Baylor College of Medicine. That Act 1 trial did show reduction in hospitalization. It wasn't powered for mortality. But then when you look at the Solidarity trial, the big, huge multinational trial, which was not blinded and was not controlled, it didn't show an effect on mortality. So there's probably effectiveness, particularly early on. So we're using dexamethasone plus remdesivir. The other antivirals still haven't been shown to be effective. The antibacterials, azithromycin, is not effective. Lopinavir, ritonavir is not effective. So those should be off the table generally. The antiparasitics, ivermectin, has not been shown to be effective. And then you get into some of the more immune modulatory, the tocilizumab, the IL-6, and those are still under investigation and should not be used outside of a clinical trial. And then lastly is the convalescent plasma and the monoclonal antibodies, which again are still under investigation as well.
So we do have some options, but again, you cannot self-medicate, because I know a lot of people go over it's so easy to get over-the-counter medicines in India. So that's the message.
Yeah, we have no indication that they work. They can be dangerous. So I would not advocate for anything outside of a clinical trial, or if you're hospitalized, dexamethasone and remdesivir. Again, those two are not going to be used outside of a hospital setting. So if you are home, you have mild to moderate symptoms, the best thing you can do, rest, hydrate, treat the symptoms, paracetamol, and just take care of your body. But the best thing is to prevent, right? So the best tools that we have, masks and physical distancing. I mean, it seems very archaic, but those are the tools that we have, and we know they work.
Yes. Some final words, Dr. Jill. I see the sun is rising at your end.
Yeah, it's morning. The time difference is so crazy. So I think the biggest thing is not to lose hope. I know this has been an incredibly stressful few months, and it's certainly not going away. So it's going to continue for probably years to come, but there is hope. There are treatments in line. There are vaccines in line. And the scientific community globally is truly extraordinary and collaborative. And this is going to turn around, and it will get there. It's just going to take some time.
Yeah, and I just second what Dr. Jill said. The world might not be the same, but we have an opportunity to build a better one. So just hang in there, safe. Yeah. And over to Shruti now. Thanks, Jill. Thanks for joining us. Yeah.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
This has been one of the most amazing sessions that we ever had, and thank you so much for such a wonderful session, Dr. Jill. And this has given us a clarity on where we stand now in terms of vaccines and the trials as well. So thank you so much for that, and thank you, Dr. Manu, for putting across the right set of questions that was there on everybody's mind. So this session has been an amazing one. So thank you so much for taking time off a busy schedule and doing this for us. Dear viewers, stay tuned for more such interesting events and take all precautions necessary to stay safe. So that is the mantra as of now. And don't forget to follow us on our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages. And for more information on Project Step 1, visit www.projectstep1.org. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. So are we done?